Old School Lane Casual Chats is brought to you by oldschoollane.blogspot.com and is associated with Channel Frederator, Manic Expression, the Comic Book Cast, and the Arun Mehta Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Casual Chats. I am Patricia, and I am back with Chris Moore, aka RowdyC. So welcome back, Chris.
Thanks, it's always a pleasure to be on here.
So, Chris actually recommended that we do a podcast discussing about the 1989 movie The Wizard in honor of its 30th anniversary. So, I'm actually curious about what made you decide to do that, Chris.
Well, like you said, it is the 30th anniversary of this particular movie. Actually, will be in December of 2019, and it just may be the fact that it seems like when you look at it, does seem like this is one of those. It's where you might actually find a type of cult movie among children, so to speak. But this was a movie that I really felt a lot of people who did grow up with it has developed a type of cult classic feeling about it. To the point where I did some research and found out that apparently, back in 2008, about 11 years ago, it was shown and screened again at the Alamo Draft House in Austin, here in Texas, on February 8th, 2008. And big enough for the fact that, of course, stars Fred Savage and Luke Edwards, along with director Tom Holland, were in attendance for that screening as well. It's definitely very clear that this what some would actually call a relatively obscure movie that just had a bunch of cheap Nintendo tie-ins still does have a pretty beloved following from a lot of people, and I'm not going to deny that I would probably be one of those people.
Yeah, am not as familiar with this movie as much as a lot of other people. I mean, it's not a movie that I personally grew up with, but I can understand the cult following, especially if you were a kid in the 80s and you were getting into the Nintendo console. And then it's like, I mean, this was even before the Super Mario Brothers movie. This was like one of the first movies that we got to see like a legit video game. I mean, yeah, we had like War Games and Tron, but we got to see oh, there's Nintendo, there's Mario references, there's Zelda references, there's a Ninja Gaiden reference, there's Double Dragon. So it was a lot more familiar as opposed to like a virtual reality or kind of like a simulator game that was made for the purpose of the particular movie.
And there was, and again, as I continue to do more research on the situation, it was a reason why there was such a tie-in to this movie, as it turns out, because. And I do remember reading something about this vaguely in Nintendo Power magazine back at the time. But at the time, in the late 1980s, Nintendo was having a bit of a problem. It wasn't a financial problem, but more of a hardware problem. Apparently, the Nintendo of America in particular had come up with a shortage of ROM chips that were necessary to make quite a few of their cartridges, and as a result, it forced the delay of the North American releases of a number of particular games, in particular Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link and Super Mario Bros. 3, the latter of which is very prominently a plot device in this movie. So obviously, what happened was Nintendo was looking for something, some type of venue to help jumpstart promotion of these games after they had to delay their releases. And I can tell you from experience, the promotion, the Ultra promotion was very real. Now, you've said this, that you never really grew up with this. I mean, by any chance, I have curiosity, you know, when was the first time you actually managed to have seen this movie?
Um, I want to say like during high school, because like around high school or college, that was I think it was around college, yeah. So around college, this may have been around like 2005, 2006. I think that I was part of this group of you know, video game enthusiasts, and I remember that they were talking about like, oh, this was like around the early to mid 2000s when the NES was starting to develop its nostalgia. Um, you know, where it's like, you know, oh, this is a console that came out about almost 20 years ago, and people were like, it was kind of like an NES resurgence at the time. And so then they decided to watch The Wizard, and I had never heard of this movie before, and I saw it, and it was like, wow. I mean, like, oh, that's that guy from the Wonder Years, and oh, you know, they're talking about Double Dragon, they're referencing the Power Glove, they're talking about you know, the Super Mario Brothers 3, and oh, there's the Cabazon dinosaurs from Pee-wee's Big Adventure. So yeah, I actually got introduced to it that way. And you know, me living in Florida at the time, I was actually pretty you know, excited to see, you know, like all these kind of interesting references to like Universal Studios, because you know, this was when I think I remember it was around that time. I think that was one of the last times that I went to Universal Studios. This was before, I think it was like a few years prior, like around maybe 2002 or 2003. This was like around the last years where Nickelodeon Studios was around. So it kind of and the scene in which where they were going over to Universal Studios in Hollywood, that was like, oh, you know, now they're going over to this place, and oh, look at the rides that they used to have. So yeah, it definitely kind of like took me back, and I think that some of the people were even making a bunch of like stupid jokes and stuff like that. But yeah, I thought it was like pretty interesting, because I mean, I was familiar with like the Super Mario Brothers movie and the Double Dragon movie and the Mortal Kombat movie and all that stuff, but you know, I was also aware of Tron and War Games, but again, you know, those were movies that, you know, it was about games, but it wasn't like an NES game or a Sega game or anything like that. So, you know, seeing this for the first time, it's like, oh, this is actually really interesting. You know, this is a movie that was about video games, like that we would know of even before the Super Mario Brothers movie. And I guess maybe partly that was why maybe we even got the Super Mario Brothers movie. I don't know.
Well, I can tell you this from my own experience, as someone who grew up as a kid in the 80s. I saw this movie in its original theatrical release. In fact, I actually saw it 6 times in theaters, which I believe to this day remains my own personal record for most number of times I saw one film in cinema. So, and I can tell you, I was among those that saw all of the hype and stuff. You gotta keep in mind, this movie came out, I think, roughly a year after Nintendo Power magazine debuted itself. I actually was one of the people who got the very first issue of Nintendo Power when it was released in the fall of 1998, and I was one of the magazine's very first subscribers. And then back when the fall of 1989 came about, this movie was heavily promoted in that magazine. It was one of those I had to go see almost on the first weekend it was out. My parents and I went to the theaters. The ushers in the theaters had been instructed to hand out these miniature copies of Nintendo Power at the screenings. So the heavy promotion and cooperation between the film's producers and Nintendo was very real, and I can tell you firsthand. And yeah, it probably did help spike the game sales, because as you may not know, Super Mario Brothers 3 was ultimately released a few months later in March of 1990, I believe was the exact time. I think it definitely spurred interest in that game. But however, I do think one of the things that made me want to talk about this was it does make me think about upon seeing that there's still a number of people that find that have a kind of love affair with this movie, and it made me think, what exactly is it about this movie? Is it just the video game tie-ins? I think there might be actually a bit more to it than that, the more and more I think about it.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that it's probably because of the characters themselves, especially with Jimmy, where he is going through some post-traumatic stress disorder because of his sister. And, his love and passion is about video games. And you get to see it I guess I think I remember like a few years ago, like somebody was mentioning this on, I forget, it was either Twitter or YouTube or something like that. But essentially they were saying that The Wizard was a child's version of Rain Man.
Yeah, actually, it was. And in fact, I think I'm looking over here at some of the information on the critical reception. In fact, they said that there was actually a Washington Post writer at the time who actually called it a ripoff of Rain Man. I actually thought of a different comparison to it, to be perfectly honest. I think one of the reasons this movie is, maybe there are some comparisons to that, and the fact that and maybe people can identify with the character of Jimmy Woods in that regards. But for me, it's the fact that besides just the video game tie-ins, this movie is essentially a children's road trip film. And I think a lot of people my age, watched this and kind of had that fantasy of wanting to make a cross-country trip like these three kids do, all on their own, and having these type of adventures, just basically traveling from Utah to Colorado, just by the skin of their teeth, and on their ability to use their gaming abilities to essentially pay their way to Universal Studios, to this big video game competition. In fact, I also admit personally, it was very fun to see Universal Studios in this movie, because I had actually gotten to go to a vacation in California, and I actually went to Universal Studios about a year or two before that movie came out. So I was actually I actually had been on that tour train ride through places like the King Kong studio exhibit that's shown in this movie instead. So that was what kind of another fun fact for me, as I was a kid watching this thing, to see this movie taking place on those same rides that I got to experience myself watching this. But going back to what I was saying, I think there was a sense of the setting does, I think, fulfilled a lot of desire for adventures that a lot of kids might accomplish. At the same time, I think that there are some kids that probably, it's also a story about a family struggling, that did struggle. It's not just Jimmy, really. It's actually the entire family trying to struggle from what was a very tragic event that ended up splitting the family up. And it's all about their struggles to try and ultimately reconcile with one another. And I think anybody who's seen their family go through any type of breakup like that could probably identify with that. And there probably are quite a few people that in that regard found a way towards, found a connection in this movie.
Yeah, I think that for the most part, for any people who were coping with a tragedy, trying to find something happier that they can be able to find in common so that they can be able to come together. And in this case, it was video games. And you know what? I mean, it's a good thing too, because nowadays with everything that's been going on recently with all these violent attacks, everybody's putting down video games in a negative way, saying like video games cause all the violence and all the shootings and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, like video games are like universal for a lot of people. I mean, not the Universal Studios joke, but I'm just saying. But anyway, yeah, I mean, like the adults are playing it and the kids are playing it. There's this huge video game tournament that people are taking really seriously. And yeah, maybe the some of the video game references, can be a bit cringeworthy, but you have to understand that, they were trying to appeal what kids thought was cool. And it's like, oh, you have a mention here of this game, and oh, they're showing it on the TV and stuff like that, which yeah, I mean, since this was one of the very first, movies that was based off of a popular video game company, using all of the games as ways to represent, like, these are the games that people absolutely love, but it's not just because it's fun, but it's because it's part of a plot point that Jimmy wants to go to California. And then along the way, they enter into this big gaming tournament. But the main story is that Jimmy wants to go to California so that he can be able to drop the pictures off of his sister at the Calabazon dinosaurs, because that was where he had the happiest memories with her. And I mean, that's essentially what the story is. The video games is kind of like an part of it, yes, but it's not the main focus. But I guess when we were kids, we didn't care about the story. We just wanted to see the video games.
It's kind of a situation where maybe it was the video games that kind of drawn us in as kids. But looking at more now as adults, we could kind of see the more deeper aspects of that story. And I think another person who might probably agree with this, looking this up, was a writer for The Guardian by the name of Tola Onanuga, who wrote her own article about last year on the movie, which he called the movie one of her guilty pleasures. I'll spare the entire story, but this is how her final paragraph on it, which she says, yes, The Wizard is full of bloopers and utterly shameless in its product placement. But frankly, anyone who doesn't get a warm and fuzzy feeling watching a grief-stricken young boy cure his emotional trauma by playing Super Mario Bros. 3 in front of a live euphoric audience is a heartless monster.
Well, yeah, and for the Roald Dahl retrospective, Aaron and we were discussing about that. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was made as product placement for the Quaker Oats Company to promote their candy. Yet at the same time, that's become a bit, that's become like a cultural icon. So yeah, sometimes that does tend to happen. That there is going to be a movie out there that is going to be promoting something, whether it's going to promote a toy like with Transformers or My Little Pony Friendship is Magic or something like that, or it could promote a series of like there's also the Lego movie that is, let's be honest, I mean, it's kind of like there to promote the toys, but at the same time it's written in a great way that people just overlook the fact that it's product placement. There's a lot of cases in which, like, yes, I mean, we may be paying attention to the fact that, oh, they're making a movie based off of this thing, but there are times in which it can strike gold.
And it definitely, I want to know if it would, at least by the numbers, it may not play stricken gold in the sense of, at least as far as its original theatrical take, but it did end up turning a modest profit. I think what it says here, at the theaters, it grossed just over $14 million on a $6 million budget. And that's actually even more impressive when you know that, again, this movie came out in December of 1989. And just for reference, it was only the previous month that we had seen the releases of both Back to the Future Part 2 and Disney's The Little Mermaid. They were probably still in theater. I believe they were still in theaters at that time. And this was 30 years ago where, movies still had a bit more staying power in their theatrical run. It wasn't a situation where a lot of people just forget about going to see it after the first couple of weeks or so. So this movie, The Wizard, it definitely had some strong competition at the theaters at the time it ran. And for it to at least turn a $6 million, I guess ultimately a $8 million profit in theater. And I think over here it's by 1993, it grossed an additional $6 million in video rentals. It's scheduled to get a special edition Blu-ray release next March, according to my research. So whatever the producers, the directors, Tom Holland, and its backing with the Nintendo company did, it did succeed in some small level, and the fact that other people, including ourselves, are talking about it 30 years later, it definitely does fit the definition of cult classic in my view.
Yeah, and also not to mention that I think it's one of the more, I want to say it's one of the more definitive films that is a product of its time that people nowadays are very fascinated on looking at because, oh, it came out in this time period. It's like, it's kind of like a gateway towards a particular decade. Like how in the 90s, people still love watching Space Jam and Good Burger for the exact same reasons.
Yeah,
and that's
especially the fact that this movie, of course, the fact that they had to throw in some New Kids on the Block songs in this movie as well.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think that for the most part, newer generations probably are familiar with this movie probably because of like online reviews. I know that James Rolfe discussed about it in his Super Mario Brothers 3 video. That's probably one of the more infamous episodes that he's been part of because, it also featured like the Super Mega Death Christ character, and also. Let's see. I think that there's been a lot of online reviews of it, and I think a few years ago there was even a Wizard reunion, which is not too surprising because I do know of like in recent years I've been seeing a lot of people reuniting themselves and having like these reunion specials, whether it be like from a famous movie or even a cult classic movie. I mean, it's. I remember that they were talking about how their experience was with working on the film and how much they enjoyed it, and how I think that some of them weren't even familiar with video games until they got casted in the movie. So yeah, and then they were also talking about like they were still surprised that people were still talking about it. It's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it did at the very least. I mean, some of the stars in it did still get, of course. Fred Savage at the time was a major star on the Wonder Years. You pointed out he is. I do know that the kid who played Jimmy, Luke Edwards, he got at least one other starring film later on, a few years later. I don't know if you've seen it or not, because he starred in the baseball-themed movie Little Big League.
I have seen Little Big League, yes. Okay.
And then, of course, you might know, of course, Jenny Lewis, who played Haley. I know she also, I don't remember if it was before, I think it was before her. She had previously starred in Troop Beverly Hills, the movie with Shelley Long. In fact, I think both. In fact, fun fact, both Jenny Lewis and the girl who played in Small Wonder were in that movie as well. Just happened to know that.
I also know that Jenny also teamed up with Blake Sennett to start a band called what was it called? Rilo Kiley. And Blake Sennett is the guy who played as what was it? He was in Salute Your Shorts. I remember. Yeah, he was. Which character was he again? But I think he was in. Yeah, he was one of the characters in Salute Your Shorts, and he started his own band, and Jenny Lewis was a part of it.
Yeah,
so I know her from that.
Yeah, and Miss Lewis actually, of course, you might not aware, has continued on with her own music career. I heard a couple of her songs being played on Nash's Radio Deader show, and then eventually I actually got to see her live in performance. She can't drop by here in Dallas some months ago. I actually got her poster hanging on my wall here. Some decent music there as well. Yeah. So definitely she is someone who has managed to craft her own path, so to speak, in the wake of that movie as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of famous people in this movie. I mean, we have Christian Slater, Beau Bridges, Tobey Maguire is actually in this movie. This was his very first movie he's ever been in, if you can believe it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, you actually do have a decent amount of people in this film, and I think that I think at the time Fred Savage is probably like the main poster child in this. I mean, if you see in posters and even on like the VHS tapes and all that stuff, you would see Fred Savage's name like being top billed because he was very known for the Wonder Years.
Yeah, absolutely. There, and it was actually the movie that got me to interested in of course the Wonder Years show itself. I ended up watching some episodes on that later on. So in that case, the movie probably helped. Maybe help push some more success of that show as well.
Yeah, I mean, this and the Wonder Years and The Princess Bride and also Little Monsters as well. Yeah, he was like he had a booming child career for sure.
Absolutely.
And he wasn't one of the child actors who went insane.
Yeah, no. In fact, I can't. I will say this: is that the his supposed cameo in the Family Guy episode Foxy Lady. It's one of the few gags of modern Family Guy I actually found somewhat entertaining. I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I haven't seen Family Guy in a very long time, so I wouldn't know.
Understandable.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that a lot of people, another reason why it's still remembered is because they poke fun of it. As mentioned before about like, oh, video game references and all that stuff. But there's also the infamous scene where we have the main rival Lucas showing off the Power Glove.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he is playing, a racing game, and he's showing off his skills, and then he says his famous line, "I love the Power Glove, it's so bad." And to be fair, those kind of characters were pretty prominent around the 80s and 90s, like, oh, the tough kid who looks cool with the jacket and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
And I think another reason why some people still remember it is because we have the Video Armageddon tournament. And I think that this is where Nintendo got their inspiration for their Nintendo World Championship.
Oh, it absolutely was. And in fact, I actually took part in that first competition when it visited Dallas and Fair Park about a few months after that movie premiered.
Oh, wow. What was that experience like?
Here's the thing. It was the competition. You were basically playing 3 games one after the other. You started with Super Mario, the original Super Mario Brothers, and like once you got a certain amount of coins or across a certain level, then they switched to Rad Racer, the racing game. And once you completed the first course there, they switched over to Tetris, and that was when you got the remainder of your points to try to get in. And I'll just never remember, the timer went off. The game timer went off just a second before I was about to complete a 4-line Tetris in the game that I was almost certain, had I made that, I would have gone on to the second round. And I just missed it by a matter of seconds from advancing.
Oh, that's rough, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of sad that they didn't really take off. I mean, I know that we had a few competitions, like there was the Star Fox one, and I think that there was even a Donkey Kong Country cartridge that you got to check out. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, around that time, I mean, I guess maybe we had Evo and stuff like that for fighting games, but regular games platformers and racing games and all that kind of stuff. I guess it didn't. I mean, I guess it. At the time when video games were just starting out, when we had video, we had Nick Arcade, and we had various TV shows that promoted video games, on MTV or something like that. They were just starting out, but I'm really glad that we had to wait until 2015 for the Nintendo World Championship to come back, and then it happened a few years later. So this is definitely showing that of how much of a big prevalence that those kind of tournaments happen because of the Wizard.
Absolutely, it was, like I said, the late 80s were really a time when, again, the video games were probably still making their way back into the public consciousness and popularity after the struggles of the early 80s that led, of course, to the infamous crash of 83. I can tell you, just from firsthand, I was there to experience a lot of it, that was a time when Nintendo really was the driving force and the number one player in the at least the American video game market. And yeah, they may have lost some of their ground by the late 90s. Of course, still have never really recovered it. They've been the butt of a few jokes in recent years whenever they get the opportunity. It seems like they're always up and down. But I can tell you, it was stuff like the release of the Super Mario games, the release of the Zelda games, that started moving them back into the public consciousness. And yeah, you probably have to think that this movie, one, it did help promote a more positive image of video games and gaming, while also subtly, I think, telling a story that, in retrospect, a lot of people found themselves identifying with. And that, as much as anything else, it's kind of a combination of both. The nostalgia of the video games a lot of us grew up with, combined with that type of story of adventure and trying to reconnect with your old family again, those two combined is probably the reasons why a lot of people still have quite a few fond memories of this movie, even 30 years later.
Yeah, and I guess not only that, but also the story, going back to it. It's not so yeah, it's not only, the Woods family that is going through this trauma and this broken relationship and all that kind of stuff. It's also the Haley as well. She wants to be able to bring her family together for them to have a happy life, because it's revealed later in the movie that what she was saying, like, oh, she was going back home and stuff like that. It's revealed that she lives in a trailer park and her mom is like this irresponsible person who is gambling all their money, and she wants to use the prize money if they win so that they can be able to get a nice house with her father so they can be able to live happy lives. I think that's probably why, I mean, there's like this connected storyline with like bringing family together in a safe, in a positive, and in a very comforted way, in which they want to mend their families from being broken, whether it be because of either tragedy or whether it be to unfortunate circumstances caused by irresponsibility.
Absolutely. It's something that even back in the late 1980s, you have to figure there were a growing number of families and kids that were having to deal with issues like this, and the movie did help maybe give a lot of these people some glimmer of hope that perhaps any type of a household or family that got broken up, especially by tragedy, that if you just continue to stop, if you never give up on it, one day you may be able to patch things back together in some form or fashion.
Yeah. And they were able to do it all because of video games, which is one of the more positive bits of media that has video games presented in a way that's not saying like, oh, it causes violence, oh, it's a waste of time and all that kind of stuff. Because, I mean, we've seen a lot of like media that, you have these characters who are saying like, video games are a waste of time, and, why are you, sitting around playing this game all day? Don't you have anything better to do? But in this movie, it's the thing that brought them together. So it is a positive thing that happens to these group of kids and for their families. I mean, how often can you say that? I mean, like, the only time in which I've seen video games portrayed in a positive light that has gotten like a huge cult following was Scott Pilgrim versus the World and Wreck-It Ralph.
There haven't been that many. You're correct. There haven't been that many films that try to really perhaps do a positive focus on video games. But we can always go back to this one that came out, just some guy's small independent film that may have been a cross between Rain Man and a Bob Hope road trip movie that threw in a bunch of blatant product placement for Nintendo, but ended up crafting a story that shows how almost anything out there, especially something like video games, can be used to bring a family back together again. Or who knows what other positive outcomes might be a result of it if you just look for those positive outcomes.
Yeah, I agree as well. So are there any final words that you want to say about this movie right before we conclude it?
Well, no, just guess the fact that it is nice to read up and see how many other people did in fact grow up with this movie, and even people like yourself that maybe didn't catch on to it until a much later age and found a way to see what was so special about it, from those of us who grew up in the 80s and saw the rebuild of the video game craze, and just why this movie did end up striking a nostalgic chord with us all these years later.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that, even for when I was watching it the first time back when I was in college, my friends from school were already starting to develop like nostalgic feelings for the NES, because it was at a time in which when, Nintendo was having the Wii and it was like the new system, but at the same time, this was when people were looking back on the NES fondly, saying like, hey, sure, we have like Super Mario, Super Mario Galaxy and then Twilight Princess and, all those things. It's like, hey, remember like Super Mario Brothers 3 and you remember, Castlevania and Mega Man and all those things. And, I think that because of the advent of like the internet with Screw Attack and PBT Productions and James Rolfe and all those people where they, and, pretty much everybody from game trailers were like talking about like looking back on NES games fondly and talking about the movie. And I think that, when I saw it, I think I saw it at the right time in a way as well, because it was when people were starting to talk about the NES again. And I think this is when people were starting to look back on The Wizard in a more fond kind of way, as opposed to when the movie kind of came out in theaters and the critics didn't really understand it. So, I think that's, in this day and age where, the NES has already become a huge staple in our pop culture. And, the people are familiar with all the games that came out of it, like Mario and Zelda and Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, all those games. So, and, not to mention that, it's because of this that we, video games may have gotten a lot more mainstream. We're going to have the Super Mario Brothers movie coming out really soon. And, people are excited about like the Castlevania series on Netflix. So, yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, we partly have to thank this movie for what it did.
It definitely was a very first one among the very first steps in helping push video games into the more popular lexicon. I really do believe that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I think that should be it for this podcast. So once again, Chris, thank you so much for coming on by.
Absolutely.
So please plug and promote your stuff.
Well, assuming this is going to be coming out sometime around the end of November or December. December is more or less going to be Star Wars month on TV Trash. In the wake of Episode 9 being released in theaters this December, we're going to be taking a look at 2 or 3 certain shows that came out Star Wars related that you might not have heard of, and maybe a few of them might make you cringe. Just stay tuned for that.
I think I know what you're referring to, and my goodness, good luck. So yes, thank you so much for listening, everybody. Let us know in the comments below about what are your thoughts on The Wizard. Did you grow up with it like Chris, or were you like me and you saw it much later on? What are your thoughts of it? What are your favorite moments? What was your favorite video game that was referenced? Did you connect to the story with Jimmy or with Haley, in which they were going through struggles, but because of working together and joining up this tournament, they were able to bring their families together? So please let us know. Anyway, so we are going to be continuing our streams of podcasts and videos to close off the year of 2019. So we got some more stuff coming, so stay tuned. Until then, hope to see you around soon, and take care.